Welcome, friends, to another gentle tale from the Chestnut Hollow Journal. Today we return to the cozy woods, where small creatures go about their quiet days in warmth and wonder. Find yourself a comfortable spot, perhaps a warm drink by your side, and let's step together into the peaceful world of Chestnut Hollow. Part 1. The first trickles of spring. The days were lengthening, if only by a whisker, and though the mornings still glittered with frost, something new was afoot in the old fernwood. It was in the air, the sort of thing that made the moss smell sharper, the water sparkle brighter, and the trees creak with the faintest hint of sap beginning to rise. Hazel the dormouse noticed it first one morning as she drew back the curtains of her little round window, cut neatly into the trunk of her oak tree home. There was a faint dripping drip, drip, drip from the icicles that clung to the roof's edge. When she leaned out, pulling her shawl tighter about her shoulders, she saw rivulets forming along the packed earth paths, trickling down toward the brook. The brook itself, which had slept under a thin sheet of ice for most of the winter, now babbled and chuckled again as it hurried past the roots of alders and willow saplings. "It's coming," Hazel said softly, her breath making a ghostly puff in the cold. "Spring is coming." She wasted no time in slipping on her sturdy boots, scarf, and mittens. The moment was too precious not to share, and who better to share it within her three dearest companions: Pip the squirrel, Thistle the hedgehog, and Bramble the badger. Pip, as usual, was found dangling precariously from the rafters of his loft when Hazel called at his door. His long, bushy tail swished as he scrambled down, a nut clutched between his teeth. "Hazel," he squeaked around the acorn, "you're out early. What's the rush? Come and see," Hazel urged, tugging at his paw. "The brook has woken up." Next was Thistle, who needed some coaxing to leave his snug bed by the stove. His prickles were rumpled, and he wore a knitted cap that always slid over one eye. "What's the matter with the brook?" he mumbled sleepily. "It's laughing again," Hazel said, "and so should you. Come on, fetch your boots." Lastly, they called for Bramble, who was already awake in his deep, well-ordered burrow. He had been polishing his spectacles and poring over a stack of seed catalogs. "Ah," he said, a wise twinkle in his eye when Hazel explained. "The turning of the season. Yes, I felt it too. My whiskers haven't stopped twitching all morning." He shut the catalogs with a firm snap. "Right, let's go and greet it properly." Together the four friends walked the woodland path, their paws crunching lightly on old snow and wet leaves. As they neared the brook, they saw it dancing merrily, swollen with meltwater, tumbling over stones and roots as if eager to get on with the year's business. Sunlight pierced through the branches, glinting on the water so brightly that Pip shielded his eyes with a paw. "It does look different," Thistle admitted, rubbing sleep from his face. "Almost alive." "It is alive," Hazel said gently. "It's part of the forest like us, and today it's awake again." The friends stood quietly for a long moment, listening to the brook's chatter as though it were telling them secrets. The breeze rustled in the ivy, a woodpecker tapped in the distance, and here and there, tiny buds swelled at the tips of twigs. Then Pip, restless as always, darted down to the water's edge. "I say," he cried, pointing, "look there, do you see it?" A patch of pale green shoots pushed through the damp soil near the bank. Snowdrops, brave little bells, their heads still bowed but gleaming white against the dark earth. "Oh!" Hazel clasped her paws together. "The first flowers! And more to come," Bramble nodded sagely. "This is only the beginning." They lingered so long by the brook that the sun rose high above the treetops, and their stomachs began to grumble. Thistle, ever practical when it came to food, proposed they head back to Hazel's oak tree and prepare something warm. But Hazel, brimming with excitement, had another idea. "Why don't we mark the day? The brook has awakened, and the snowdrops have risen. We should do something to honor it. Nothing fancy, mind you. just perhaps a walk downstream, to see how far the brook runs free. Pip was instantly in favor. An adventure. I'll bring my slingshot in case we meet any mischief. You'll bring your good manners instead, Bramble said firmly. The brook doesn't need battling. But yes, a walk would be fine. If the ice has melted further along, we may even spot kingfishers or water voles. So it was agreed. They packed a small satchel with Hazel's bread and cheese, Thistle's jar of honey, and a flask of tea Bramble had brewed. Pip bounded ahead, the satchel bouncing against his back, while the others followed at a steadier pace. The brook wound and wriggled like a silver ribbon, its banks lined with moss and ferns, some of which had begun to uncurl despite the chill. Here and there lay branches washed down by the thaw, creating little dams where the water gurgled impatiently before rushing on. The air smelled of damp earth, and now and then the sun spilled through, catching the mist in golden shafts. They stopped once to sit on a fallen log and share the tea, passing the flask around and munching on bread. Pip tried balancing on one paw while juggling hazelnuts, but one fell with a plop into the brook and bobbed away like a tiny boat. "Farewell, noble nut," Pip cried dramatically, waving after it. Thistle laughed so hard he nearly choked on his honey bread. Hazel dabbed her eyes, smiling, and Bramble shook his head with fond exasperation. The further they went, the more signs of spring appeared. A wagtail dipped and darted along the water's edge. Two frogs leapt startled into the brook, leaving ripples behind. They passed a patch where wild garlic was already pushing its pointed leaves up through the soil, filling the air with its sharp scent. Finally, they came to a bend where the brook widened into a pool, clear and deep. Sunlight flashed on its surface, and there, perched boldly on a low branch, was a kingfisher, its feathers a blaze of blue and orange. The four friends gasped. The kingfisher was like a shard of the sky come down to rest. It tilted its head at them, then, with a sharp cry, dived into the water and emerged with a glimmering fish in its beak. With a flick, it vanished upstream. They sat on the bank, awed into silence. "This," Bramble said at last, his voice low and reverent, "is why the turning of seasons matters. It brings the forest back to life." Hazel leaned against him, Pip stretched his tail proudly behind him, and Thistle wrapped his paws around his knees. They stayed until the shadows lengthened, then turned for home, tired but happy. By the time Hazel reached her oak tree again, the stars were pricking the sky, and the brook still whispered through the dark. She lit her lantern and thought, with a smile, tomorrow will bring even more. The morning after their walk to the wide pool, Hazel woke earlier than usual. She had dreamt of the brook in the night, dreamt it was whispering directly to her, inviting her to follow its winding way. The sound still lingered in her ears when she opened her eyes, and for once she felt no desire to roll over and drift back to sleep. She made a quick breakfast of oat cakes and honey, slipped into her shawl, and stepped outside. The frost was lighter now, only dusting the very edges of the grass, and the air carried a damp sweetness. She thought of calling for Pip, Thistle, and Bramble, but somehow this felt like a morning for solitary wandering. The brook greeted her with cheerful burbles as soon as she reached it. The water moved briskly, reflecting the sky's pale blue. Hazel followed its bank, her boots squelching softly in the damp ground, until she came to the bend where they had seen the kingfisher. There she paused, looking across the pool. On the far side, she noticed something she hadn't seen the day before, a narrow track, faint but clear, leading away from the water into the undergrowth. It looked as though small paws had passed that way many times. Hazel's whiskers twitched. "I wonder who made that path," she murmured. "And where it goes." The brook gurgled encouragingly, as if in answer. She scrambled carefully over the stones and crossed the shallowest part of the water, her boots slipping only once. On the far side, She shook herself, then pressed into the undergrowth. The path was indeed narrow, bordered by brambles and tall grasses still flattened from winter. As she followed it, she noticed tiny signs, a feather caught on a twig, gnawed nutshells in the dirt, and once, the faint impression of webbed feet. Hazel felt a thrill of discovery. She loved Fernwood dearly, but it wasn't often she stumbled upon something entirely new. The path wound for some way, and at last it opened into a small clearing, half hidden by leaning willows. In the middle of the clearing was a hollow log, moss-covered and ancient, with an opening just large enough for a small animal to enter. Hazel tiptoed forward, her heart beating quickly. She crouched and peered inside. To her surprise, the hollow was neatly arranged, a bed of dry grasses, a pile of pebbles and shells, and a little nook that looked as though it had been used for storage. No one was home at the moment, but it was clearly someone's dwelling. Just then, she heard a rustle, and Hazel drew back quickly. From the brookside came a sleek, whiskered head, dark and shining. It was a water vole, carrying a bundle of reeds in his mouth. "Oh!" Hazel exclaimed, startled. The vole froze, eyes wide, then set down the reeds. "Well, now what's this? A visitor? You nearly gave me a fright." "I am so sorry," Hazel stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude. I found the path, and, well, I was curious." The vole's whiskers twitched, then he chuckled warmly. "No harm done. Curiosity is no crime. I'm Reed, at your service. And this is my home, humble, but it keeps the rain off." Hazel's nervousness melted quickly. "I am Faisal. I live up in the oak, not far from here." "Ah, then we're neighbors of a sort," Reed said, his voice mellow and kind. "Though I keep more to the water than the trees. It's a fine day to be out, isn't it? The brook's lively this time of year. It brings me plenty of food and company, it seems." They talked for some time, Hazel telling him of her friends and their walk the day before, Reed explaining how he kept his larder stocked with roots, stems, and shoots gathered along the banks. He showed her the neat stack of shells, polished smooth by the brook, which he used as bowls and dishes. Hazel admired the cleverness of it all. At last, Reed offered to walk her back to the main path. As they went, Hazel thought how glad she had risen early. New friends could be found when one least expected it. When she returned home, Pip was waiting on her doorstep, tail twitching impatiently. "Hazel, where have you been?" "I knocked and knocked. I went for a walk," Hazel said, a little mysteriously, "and I met someone new. Come inside, I'll tell you." Over tea, she explained about Reed the vole and his mossy hollow by the brook. Pip's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Another friend? We must all meet him. Why didn't you fetch us?" "It was too early for you, Pip," Hazel teased. "Besides, I think Reed would enjoy meeting us one by one. It's less overwhelming." That evening, the four gathered at Bramble's burrow, where Hazel retold her story. Bramble nodded gravely. "The brook has always been a source of surprises. It's good to know we've a neighbor there. Tomorrow, perhaps, we can all pay him a proper visit. He may welcome some help preparing for spring." Thistle yawned but smiled. "As long as he's friendly, I'm happy. I wouldn't mind another chair at the tea table." And so was decided. The next day dawned soft and cloudy, with the brook running high after a night of light rain. Together the four friends made their way downstream again, this time carrying gifts. Hazel brought oatcakes, Pip carried a basket of hazelnuts, Thistle brought some dried apples, and Bramble carried a jar of honey. They found Reed at home, weaving reeds into a mat outside his hollow. His face lit up when he saw them. "Well, what's this?" "A welcoming committee. We thought we'd bring you something to mark the season," Bramble said with a polite bow. Reed was touched. He ushered them into his hollow, where they spread their offerings on the smooth floor. The space was snug, but they all squeezed in, Pip chattering brightly, Thistle munching on an apple, Hazel setting out cups, and Bramble explaining which flowers would bloom next along the brook. Reed listened with delight, his eyes crinkling in amusement. When they left, the light was fading and the brook murmured softly in the dusk. Hazel felt her heart swell. A new friend, new places discovered, and spring unfolding. Life in Fernwood was growing richer by the day. She looked up at the sky, where the first stars appeared. "Thank you," she whispered to the brook, "for secrets worth finding." And the brook, as always, laughed quietly to itself, as though it had known all along. A week had passed since Hazel discovered Reed's mossy hollow, and in that time the brook had grown even livelier. The weather, however, was capricious, as it so often was in early spring. Some days dawned bright, with sunlight slipping through the bare branches and making the water glitter like a mirror. Other mornings were sullen and gray, with wind rattling the reeds and fine rain misting everything into dampness. On this particular morning, the four friends woke to the sound of the brook roaring louder than usual. Hazel, who liked to listen from her window, leaned out and frowned. The steady chuckle she had grown so used to had turned into a rushing, tumbling growl. When she hurried down to the water's edge, she saw why. The rain of the previous night had swollen the brook past its usual bounds. Water surged and frothed, dragging twigs and clumps of moss with it. The little stepping stones they had once crossed were now completely submerged, and the banks were slick with mud. Hazel's first thought was of Reed. His hollow sat close to the brook after all. She wasted no time in pulling on her boots and setting off to find him. On the way, she stopped at Pip's tree, then Thistle snugged in, and finally Bramble's burrow, rallying them all. "We must check on Reed," she insisted, worry knitting her brow. Together they hurried along the path, the ground squishing beneath their paws. Pip leapt ahead with his usual energy, though he slipped once and landed in the mud with an indignant squeak. Thistle huffed and puffed, and used such a brisk pace, while Bramble kept his steady stride, muttering about how spring floods were as regular as clockwork. When at last they reached Reed's clearing, their fears were half confirmed. The water had crept dangerously close to his hollow. Though the entrance was still dry, the brook surged only a paw's length away, and the ground outside was sodden. Reed himself stood calmly by the door, a bundle of reeds in his paws, though his whiskers twitched with concern. "Reed," Hazel cried, "are you all right? The brook is nearly in your home." Reed gave a small shrug. "It rises like this most years, though I admit it's rather eager today. I've moved my bedding higher up in the log, but if it comes much further, I'll need a hand." Bramble adjusted his spectacles and surveyed the situation. "The log's sound enough," he said, tapping it with a paw, "but the entrance may not stay dry. Best not to take chances. We'll help you move what you need." And so they set to work. Pip darted in and out of the hollow, carrying Reed's smooth pebble dishes and shell bowls. Hazel carefully bundled his dried roots and herbs. Thistle hauled armfuls of bedding, his prickles sticking with bits of straw, while Bramble supervised, making sure nothing was left behind. Reed himself remained calm throughout, though Hazel caught him glancing at the water more than once. Once everything was safely piled on higher ground beneath a willow, they paused to rest. The brook roared past, sending spray into the air, but at least Reed's belongings were secure. "I'm sorry to put you all to such trouble," Reed said earnestly. "Nonsense," Hazel replied, brushing mud from her skirts. "Friends look after each other. Besides, it was rather exciting." "Speak for yourself," Thistle muttered, pulling a burr from his prickles. "My paws are soaked." Pip grinned. "You'll dry. Besides, now we can help you find a second storehouse, just in case the brook gets too bold again." That idea seemed to cheer Reed. "A sensible thought. I know a hollow stump not far from here. If we can clear it, it will make a fine dry store." So, After sharing a hasty lunch of oatcakes and apples beneath the willow, they went to investigate. The stump stood a little back from the brook, tucked among the brambles. It was half rotten, but the inside was dry and spacious. Together, they pulled out the damp moss and old leaves, swept the floor with bundles of reeds, and even laid fresh grasses from a nearby meadow. By the time they were finished, the stump was transformed into a tidy little storeroom. Reed placed his baskets of roots inside, along with several of his precious shells. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Even if the brook comes higher, I'll have what I need." The others smiled, glad to see him reassured. As they walked back toward Hazel's oak tree later that evening, the sky cleared and shafts of sunlight broke through, turning the wet leaves to gold. The brook, though still high, sparkled rather than threatened. Hazel felt the tension in her chest ease. "It's funny," she said quietly to Bramble as they walked. "The brook frightened me today, but at the same time it feels even more alive, almost as though it has moods like we do." Bramble nodded slowly. "That's a wise thought, Hazel. The brook is alive in its way. Sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, but always moving. We must respect it as we respect each other." Hazel thought about that long after she curled up in bed, listening to the brook's rushing voice. Respect, she thought. That was the key. The forest was their home, but it had its own rules, and it was their task to live in harmony with them. The next morning, when she awoke to find the brook had calmed again, Hazel smiled. They had weathered one of its moods and learned more about both the brook and themselves in the process. With the brook calmed and reed supplies safe in their new stump storehouse, Hazel thought life might return to its gentle rhythm. But spring has a way of stirring more than just brooks. It stirs creatures, too. One morning, a robin brought news. A spring market would be held in the wide meadow beyond the wood. Every year, animals from far and near brought their goods to trade. Herbs and honeys, woven mats, dried berries, polished stones, and even music. Hazel had heard of it before, but she had never gone. This year, she decided she must. When she shared the news, Pip bounced so hard on his paws that Hazel worried he might fall over. A market? With stalls and food and songs? "Oh, we must go." Thistle was less enthusiastic. "Crowds, noise, bargaining. I'd rather stay in my den." But Bramble's eyes lit up behind his spectacles. "It would be an education for us all. I haven't seen a proper market in years." Reed gave his quiet nod. "Markets are good for herbs. I might find roots I cannot gather here." So it was settled. The friends would go together. The morning of the market dawned golden. They set off across the forest, Hazel carrying a basket of her oatcakes wrapped neatly in cloth, Pip with a pouch of polished conkers, Bramble with a ledger in case trades needed recording, and Thistle reluctantly carrying nothing, for he had claimed he had nothing to offer. Reed brought bundles of dried reeds and cattail fluff for weaving. When at last they reached the meadow, Hazel gasped. Stalls were scattered across the grass like bright mushrooms. Banners fluttered, birds sang, and animals bustled from stall to stall. A family of squirrels sold acorn flour. A pair of badgers offered pots of golden honey. A crow displayed shiny buttons and glass beads. Even a hedgehog troupe performed fiddling songs near a circle of mossy stones. Pip darted at once toward the bead stall, eyes wide. Hazel trailed after him, heart fluttering with excitement. She felt shy, but also warmed by the laughter and chatter all around her. They spent the day wandering the stalls, each finding something to delight them. Hazel traded her oatcakes for a bundle of lavender and a small clay jar of blackberry jam. Pip exchanged his conkers for a whistle carved from elderwood. Reed secured bundles of dried peppermint and thyme. Even Thistle, despite his grumbling, ended up with a small woolen scarf after helping his stoat carry baskets. At noon, they sat together under an oak at the edge of the meadow, sharing their purchases. The air buzzed with life. and Hazel realized how large their world truly was. The forest was their home, but beyond it stretched other meadows, streams, hills, and woods, all full of creatures with their own lives. "It's good to be reminded we are part of something bigger," Bramble said, as if reading her thoughts. Hazel nodded. Yes, bigger indeed. In the days after the market, Pip's whistle became the heart of their gatherings. He practiced until his cheeks ached, sometimes producing lilting tunes, other times only squeaks. But Pip's joy was infectious. Hazel and Thistle teased him gently, while Reed and Bramble offered encouragement. One breezy afternoon, the friends gathered by the brook with tea and honey cakes. Pip proudly played a Johnny tune. Birds flitted down to listen, tilting their heads, and even a frog croaked along in something like harmony. Hazel clapped her paws. "Lovely, Pip," she said warmly. Pip puffed up, though he tried to look modest. "Oh, it's nothing really. Just takes practice." But it was more than nothing. The whistle seemed to carry moods, sometimes bright and tumbling like the brook, sometimes soft and wistful like the evening breeze. Hazel found herself listening deeply, feeling stories within notes. Soon Pip began to compose small songs for each of them. For Hazel, he played a melody that rose like sunlight through leaves. For Thistle, a prickly, bouncing tune that made even the hedgehog laugh. For Bramble, a stately march with pauses for thought. And for Reed, a calm, flowing strain that rippled like water. One evening, as fireflies blinked among the reeds, Pip played a soft, haunting tune that silenced even the owls. Hazel felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't grand or sorrowful, just full of yearning, like the quiet spaces between raindrops. When Pip lowered the whistle, there was a hush. Then Bramble spoke softly. "Music carries truth without words. You've given us a gift, Pip." The squirrel's ears went pink, but he beamed. From that night on, whenever the friends gathered, Pip's whistle wove its way into their evenings, becoming as much a part of their days as Hazel's baking or Bramble's wisdom. Not every day of spring was merry. One morning, Hazel awoke to find that the basket she had left by the brook, filled with oatcake for drying, was gone. She rushed to the water's edge. Only a few crumbs remained, and the ground was scuffed with small paw prints. Heart sinking, Hazel ran to Bramble. He adjusted his spectacles and studied the prints. "Mouse," he declared, "or several, likely hungry youngsters." Hazel sighed. She wasn't angry, only disappointed. "I don't mind sharing, but I wish they had asked." The friends followed the tracks through the undergrowth until they came to a hollow beneath the roots of an old pine. Inside, Hazel's basket sat empty, while 3 small field mice crouched guiltily beside it. Their whiskers trembled as Hazel appeared in the doorway. "We're sorry," squeaked the smallest. "We were so hungry." Hazel's heart softened at once. She knelt, speaking gently. "You should have asked. We would have shared gladly." The mice exchanged glances. Finally, the eldest piped up. "We thought you might say no." Hazel smiled sadly. "Then let me prove you wrong. Tomorrow, come to my oak tree. There will be enough oatcakes for everyone." The next day, she baked twice as many as usual. The mice arrived timidly, but soon were laughing with Pip and listening to his whistle. Thistle, though prickly as ever, shared nuts from his own store. Bramble gave them advice about finding safe foraging spots, while Reed promised to show them where mint grew along the brook. By evening, Hazel's disappointment had melted into something new, joy in knowing their circle of friends had grown. The forest always seemed larger when more hearts were included. That night, as Hazel tidied the kitchen, she realized something. Perhaps the basket wasn't lost after all. It had simply found its way to those who needed it most, and in doing so, had brought them all together. Hazel's oak had always been a place of warmth, with its kitchen that smelled faintly of nutmeg, its shelves of jars, and the round windows that let in streams of green filtered light. But lately Hazel felt a stirring restlessness. Perhaps it was the way Pip's whistle drew more and more neighbors to their little circle by the brook, or the way the three young mice had started dropping by nearly every afternoon for oat cakes and chatter. The oak was cozy, but Hazel dreamed of more, of a garden. She had always envied Reed's skill with plants, how he seemed to coax herbs into thriving wherever he touched the soil. But Hazel had never tried gardening herself. She foraged, she baked, she brewed, but planting, tending, and growing? That felt new. One morning, she took her idea to the others. "I'd like to make a garden by the oak," Hazel announced as they gathered for tea beneath the willow near the brook. Nothing fancy, just a patch for herbs, perhaps a few flowers, maybe carrots or radishes. Pip clapped his paws. "Oh, then we'll always have snacks right at your doorstep. Count me in." Thistle raised a skeptical brow. "Gardens mean digging, watering, weeding. I'll help if you promise not to make me weed too much." Reed's quiet eyes gleamed. "I'll show you where the soil is richest, and I can share cuttings from my reeds and mint." Bramble tapped his ledger thoughtfully. "A garden is a fine investment. You'll see returns not only in food, but in peace of mind. Let's all help." So it was decided. They spent the next several days preparing the patch of ground on the sunny side of Hazel's oak. Pip fetched stones to mark neat borders, while Thistle reluctantly helped clear brambles. Bramble made careful notes of which plants liked which soil. Reed knelt silently in the earth, loosening clumps of soil with his paws, murmuring as if the ground itself were listening. Hazel herself felt both nervous and exhilarated. Her paws weren't used to digging for seedlings, but she found the work grounding, literally. She planted rows of carrots and radishes, tucked in herbs like thyme, sage, and chamomile, and scattered seeds of daisies and marigolds just for cheer. When the work was done, they stood back to admire it. The patch was not large, but it looked tidy and full of promise, with neat rows and little markers Bramble had written on smooth pebbles. Carrot, radish, mint, thyme. "That doesn't look so bad," Thistle admitted, brushing soil off his prickles. Hazel felt her heart swell. It was only bare earth now, but she could already imagine the rows of green sprouting, the flowers nodding, the scent of herbs carried through her windows. Over the weeks that followed, tending the garden became part of Hazel's rhythm. Each morning, she watered the seedlings, pulling tiny weeds, smiling as she saw the first leaves uncurl. Sometimes the young mice came to help, their little paws clumsy but eager. Pip serenaded the seedlings with his whistle, claiming that music helped them grow faster. Bramble recorded each plant's progress with scholarly precision. Reed checked the soil moisture with gentle care. Hazel herself learned patience. Baking gave results in hours. Gardening gave results in weeks, even months. But when she finally pulled her first carrot, a small, crooked thing, orange and sweet, she felt as proud as if she had baked the grandest cake. The garden quickly became more than a patch of soil. It became a place of gathering. Friends came not just for tea, but to sit on the grassy edge, watch bees buzz among the flowers, and talk. Hazel often caught herself simply sitting, paws in her lap, gazing at the little rows and feeling her heart at rest. For Hazel, the garden was not just food. It was hope. It was proof that life, given care and time, grew into beauty. The three young mice, Nibble, Tansy, and Quick, had quickly become Pip's shadow. They adored his whistle, his stories, and his endless energy. Pip, in turn, relished being admired. But admiration is a tricky thing. It often leads to showing off. One afternoon, Pip led the mice into the deeper woods. "I'll show you a secret place," he declared, puffing out his chest. "A place where the trees whisper secrets, and the moss is softer than any bed." The mice followed eagerly, squeaking questions and giggling. Pip marched ahead, feeling grand. But as they wound farther from the brook, the trees grew thicker, the undergrowth denser. Pip realized with a jolt that he wasn't entirely sure of the path. "Do you know where we're going?" Nibble squeaked nervously. "Of course I do," Pip said, though his tail twitched with uncertainty. They walked on. The sun slanted lower, and the shadows stretched long. The mice began to huddle closer together. Quick stumbled over a root, and Tansy squeaked. Pip's bravado faltered. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt a knot of worry in his chest. He had led them here, and now he wasn't sure he could lead them back. Then he remembered something Bramble had once said: "When you're lost, don't rush. Pause. Look. Listen." Pip closed his eyes, ears twitching. He heard the rustle of leaves, the call of a woodpecker, and then, faintly, the bubbling murmur of water. Relief flooded him. The brook. If they followed the sound, they'd be safe. "Come on," Pip said, voice steadier. "This way." He led the mice toward the sound, carefully this time, checking every turn. At last the trees opened, and they spilled out beside the brook, not far from Hazel's oak. The mice squeaked in relief, hugging each other. Pip sagged with equal relief, though he tried to hide it behind a grin. "See? I told you I knew the way." But when they returned, Hazel scolded him gently. "Pip, you must be careful. They look up to you. That means you must protect them, not frighten them." Pip's ears drooped. He hadn't meant harm. He only wanted to be brave. Later that night, he sat by the brook, whistle and paw, thinking. When he played, the tune that came out was softer than his usual bold melodies, a tune full of apology and learning. And though no words were spoken, Hazel, listening from her window, understood. Pip had learned something that day about responsibility and about what it truly meant to be admired. Spring storms came often, sudden and wild. One morning, thunder rolled through the forest, and rain poured so heavily that the brook leapt its banks again, though only a little. Hazel's garden bent beneath the downpour, leaves trembling under the weight of water. Hazel fretted, pacing by her window, but there was nothing to do except wait. Soon Pip came splashing through the rain, soaked to the skin but laughing. "Hazel, let's have a rainy day gathering. We can't work outside, so let's stay in." One by one, the others arrived, dripping but cheerful. Reed brought herbs for tea. Thistle carried a basket of nuts, and Bramble carried a stack of old books he had rescued from a damp burrow long ago. Even the mice scampered in, shaking water from their whiskers. Hazel lit candles, set a fire in the hearth, and spread blankets on the floor. The oak filled with warmth and chatter. They sipped tea, nibbled hazelnut biscuits, and listened to the rain drumming on the leaves. Bramble read aloud from one of his books, a tale of a brave hedgehog who built a library in a hollow log. Pip played his whistle softly in the background, weaving tunes between the words. The mice curled together under a blanket, listening with wide eyes. Reed brewed a calming tea, filling the room with the scent of chamomile. Hazel sat watching them all, heart swelling. Outside, the rain battered the forest, but inside, her oak tree glowed with comfort. At one point, Pip put down his whistle and leaned back against the hearth. "You know," he said, "rainy days might be my favorite. They make everyone come together." Hazel smiled. "Yes, they remind us that even when storms rage outside, warmth can always be found within." And so they spent the day, safe and snug, while the rain washed the forest clean. When evening came, the storm passed, and the air outside smelled of earth and new beginnings. Hazel stepped out onto her porch, breathing deep, her paws still warm from the fire, her heart steady with gratitude. The brook was running lower now that spring rains had passed, and its stones glistened in the warm sun. Pip, always restless, was the first to notice a place where the water widened into a gentle pool, hidden partly by a bend and framed by ferns. "Look here," he called one morning, splashing his paws and flicking droplets into the air. "It's like the brook made us our own pond." Hazel leaned over, careful not to slip, and peered at the water. It was clear as glass, and minnows darted like silver arrows below the surface. A water strider skimmed gracefully across, barely dimpling the surface. Thistle sniffed. "Looks like trouble. Someone will fall in." Or, Reed said softly, crouching to touch the water, "Someone will find peace." The water here is still enough to reflect the trees. Bramble had already taken out his notebook, scribbling. "A pool by the brook. This may be useful. A place to watch, to think, to study." The young mice, of course, squeaked with delight. They knelt on the stones, tossing crumbs to watch the minnows dart closer. Pip joined them, making up names for each fish, which only led to confusion since he forgot which was which a moment later. It wasn't long before the pool became a gathering spot. Some days Hazel would bring a basket of scones to share, sitting on the grass and sipping tea from a flask while she watched the minnows. Bramble set up a flat stone as a writing desk, noting the kinds of plants that grew near the water. Reed brought cuttings to soak, dipping roots into the shallows. Even Thistle, despite his grumbles, could often be found sprawled on the warm bank, his spines gleaming in the sunlight. "It's too far to walk back and forth every time you lot want to sit here," he explained, though no one believed him. One afternoon, Pip decided to see how deep the pool went. He waded in, squeaking as the cool water reached his fur. The minnows scattered like sparks. The mice shouted encouragement. Pip stepped carefully until the water was almost up to his belly, then gasped. "There's a stone in the middle, flat as a table." He scrambled onto it, dripping but triumphant, tail waving like a flag. "This shall be my island." Hazel rolled her eyes, but smiled. "Don't get too proud. You'll slip." Pip, of course, puffed out his chest. "Never. I am the ruler of the brook pool." And then, predictably, he slipped. The splash sent the mice squealing with laughter. Pip surfaced, sputtering, and bowed dramatically. "And that," he declared, dripping wet, "was my royal performance." From then on, the pool was no longer just a quiet spot. It became a place of play, reflection, and friendship. The minnows grew used to their noisy visitors. The reeds whispered in the breeze, and the little company of woodland folk found that every day seemed brighter when they had the brook's secret pool to share. Bramble had always been one for order. He liked his ledgers neat, his jars labeled, his shelves dusted. But now that their days brimmed with activity, Hazel's garden, Pip's discoveries, Reed's herbs, Thistle's reluctant companionship, he realized something. Oak Hollow and its surroundings had never truly been mapped. One morning, he announced his plan over breakfast. "I shall make a map of our world. Every tree, every hollow, every path. The brook, the pool, Hazel's oak, Reed's marsh, Thistle's burrow, all of it." Hazel tilted her head. "A map? We know where things are." "Yes," Bramble said, pushing his spectacles up his snout. "You know, but the young mice don't. And one day, new neighbors will come. A map will help everyone understand how our home fits together." Pip leapt up. "Oh, let me help. I'll point out all the places where I've had adventures." "That may not narrow it down," Thistle muttered. But soon Bramble set to work. He carried a small satchel with ink, quills, and parchment. Each day, he and whoever cared to join him would tramp through the forest, marking landmarks, measuring distances by pacing carefully and drawing neat lines on the page. Hazel walked with him to mark her garden and oak, fussing over whether he should draw the window boxes or not. Pip dragged him off to see every stump, hillock, and fallen log, declaring each a site of grand importance. Reed showed him quiet corners of the marsh where herbs grew. Even Thistle reluctantly pointed out which brambles hid his burrow. The mice followed too, carrying twine and sticks, measuring distances the way Bramble instructed. 17 steps from the oak to the bend in the brook. Quick called out proudly. Bramble's map grew day by day, filling with careful inked trees, winding lines for the brook, little marks for burrows and gardens. He inked Hazel's oak with a tiny flourish, a neat round circle with a door and window. The brook pool became a little oval. Reed's marsh was shaded with tiny strokes. It became more than just a map. It became a picture of their life together, each landmark holding a memory. Where Pip had slipped into the pool, where Hazel first found mint, where Thistle once got tangled in brambles. One evening, Bramble spread the finished map on Hazel's table. Everyone gathered round, leaning close, eyes shining in the candlelight. "It's beautiful," Hazel whispered. "It makes our home look important," Pip said proudly. "It makes our home look loved," Reed corrected softly, and Bramble, polishing his spectacles, allowed himself a small smile. He had not only mapped the land, he had mapped their hearts. The heat of summer lay heavy on Oak Hollow, golden and humming. Bees droned lazily, grasshoppers chirped, and the brook glistened in the sunlight. Hazel's garden had grown lush, with tall stalks of carrots and herbs spilling fragrance into the air. The pool sparkled in the sun, now shaded by leafy ferns. One evening, after a long hot day, Hazel suggested they spend the twilight outdoors. She set out a cloth beneath the oak. Pip brought his whistle. Reed carried chilled herbal water in clay cups, and Thistle, grumbling all the while, arrived with roasted chestnuts. The mice ran about chasing fireflies, squeaking as the little lights blinked on and off. Pip joined them, whistling a tune that matched the flickers, quick and playful. Reed watched with a small smile, paws folded in his lap, while Bramble muttered about cataloging the fireflies, but eventually leaned back and simply enjoyed the sight. As the sky deepened from gold to lavender, Hazel lit a lantern. Its glow mingled with the fireflies until it seemed the air itself was full of stars. "This," Hazel said softly, watching the garden sway in the evening breeze, "is why I wanted the garden. To have a place to sit at the end of the day, with friends, and feel that everything is just as it should be." For a while, no one spoke. They only listened, to the brook murmuring nearby, to the whisper of leaves, to the soft chorus of crickets. Pip's whistle fell silent too, and he stretched out on the grass, tail twitching contentedly. Then Thistle, of all creatures, broke the silence. "I suppose," he said gruffly, "that this is pleasant." Hazel laughed. "High praise coming from you." The night deepened. Stars came out, countless and glittering, and the fireflies slowly drifted away. One by one, the mice curled up and fell asleep on the blanket. Reed nodded off. Bramble's head drooped over his notebook, and even Pip's tail stilled. Hazel remained awake a while longer, watching her friends breathe softly under the summer sky. She thought of the map, the garden, the pool, and all the little things that had knit them together. And in that moment, she felt certain, no matter what small challenges came, no matter how the seasons turned, Oak Hollow would always be a place of friendship, comfort, and peace. It was a rare morning when the quiet paths of Oak Hollow carried footsteps not their own. Hazel heard the sound first, a faint jingling, a soft hum of wheels over earth. She leaned out of her oak window and spotted a small cart trundling up the lane, pulled by two sturdy field mice. Perched on the seat was a squirrel with a wide-brimmed hat and a pack on his back, humming a jaunty tune. Hazel called to the others, and soon Pip, Reed, Bramble, and even Thistle gathered to watch the stranger approach. The squirrel tipped his hat as he halted by Hazel's gate. "Good day, good neighbors. Name's Quince. I trade in small things, curious things, useful things. May I show my wares?" Pip practically bounced in place. "Oh yes, show us everything." Hazel, ever the hostess, invited Quince to spread his goods on a cloth in the garden. Soon the ground was dotted with wonders: glass beads that sparkled like drops of dew, tiny scissors shaped like bird beaks, ribbons in every color, spools of thread finer than spider silk, even a small whistle carved from bone. Bramble examined the items with a scholar's eye. "What's this?" he asked, holding up a folded square of parchment. "Ah, a map of the wider woodlands," Quince said proudly. "Not as fine as your own map, I'll wager, but it shows where the river runs, where the hills rise, even a distant orchard tended by hares." Bramble flushed with pleasure, but quickly adjusted his spectacles. "Interesting, very interesting." Reed found a packet of dried lavender and fennel seeds. He sniffed them carefully. "These are good quality. I'll take them." Hazel admired the ribbons, imagining them tied around jars or woven into garlands for the mice. She chose a length of soft blue, while Pip declared he must have the bone whistle. Thistle at first scowled and muttered that it was all nonsense, but eventually he slipped a small whetstone into his pouch. As the trading finished, Quince accepted not coins but barter. Hazel's fresh scones, Reed's herbs, Pip's offer of firewood, Bramble's spare ink, and even Thistle's promise of chestnuts in the autumn. When the deals were done, Quince sat with them under Hazel's oak, sharing tea and tales. He spoke of distant glades where fireflies gathered in swarms so thick they turned night into day, of burrows where badgers told stories that lasted till dawn, of a pond where frogs sang like a choir. The friends listened, spellbound. Even Thistle's eyes softened as the squirrel described a winter market lit by lanterns carved from ice. At last Quince rose, tipped his hat again, and hitched his cart. "I'll pass this way again when the leaves turn," he promised. "Keep me in mind, friends of Oak Hollow." And just like that, he trundled off down the lane, leaving behind small treasures, and a sense that their little corner of the world was part of something larger and grander. The night after Quince's visit, Pip could hardly sit still. The squirrel's tales of distant festivals had ignited his imagination. So when the mice suggested they play by the brook, Pip clapped his paws. "I've got it! A race, at night, with lanterns, just like the frog choir pond Quince spoke of. We'll make lanterns, set them afloat, and chase them downstream." The mice squealed with excitement. Hazel raised a brow. "That sounds messy. That sounds fun," Pip countered. So, for the next 2 days, Oak Hollow was full of flutter and craft. Hazel donated scraps of ribbon and parchment. Bramble measured sticks for frames. Reed prepared natural dyes from berries. Even Thistle carved small bark bases for lanterns, muttering all the while, but clearly taking pride in his handiwork. By the evening of the race, they had a dozen small lanterns, spheres, cubes, some shaped like stars, all glowing gently with tiny candles secured inside. Hazel lined them up at the brook's edge as twilight deepened. "Rules are simple," Pip declared. "We each release one lantern. First to reach the pool wins." The mice released theirs with squeals. Pip tossed his dramatically. Hazel carefully nudged hers in, watching the flame reflect on the water. Reed's glowed green from a coating of crushed mint leaves, while Bramble's was perfectly symmetrical, inked with neat patterns. The brook carried them along, bobbing and swaying. The friends ran along the bank, shouting encouragement, slipping on grass, laughing breathlessly. Fireflies blinked overhead, adding to the spectacle. "Go, Hazel's lantern," squeaked Quick. "Mine's ahead, mine's ahead," Pip yelled, though his was actually tangled briefly in reeds. At the pool, the lanterns gathered, some spinning in lazy circles. The winner was difficult to judge, but Pip insisted his had clearly arrived first after freeing itself. Hazel only laughed and handed him a blueberry tart as a prize. Then, instead of ending the race, they all sat by the pool, watching the lanterns drift together. Their reflections shimmered across the water, mixing flame, color, and starlight. "It feels like magic," Reed said quietly, and for a moment, no one could disagree. The next week brought heavy clouds. The air grew thick, the forest hushed. Hazel sniffed the sky and said, "Storm coming." Sure enough, that night the winds rose, trees swayed, and thunder growled like a distant bear. Rain poured down, drumming on Hazel's roof. Everyone stayed snug inside, except Thistle. In the morning, Hazel noticed he hadn't appeared. She frowned. He should have come to wait out here. His burrow might have flooded. The friends hurried through dripping leaves to Thistle's bramble thicket. There they found a hedgehog struggling to push wet branches aside. His burrow entrance had collapsed in the storm. "I'm Fina," Thistle barked, though he looked exhausted and damp. "You're not fine," Hazel said firmly. "You'll come with us until it's repaired." Thistle grumbled, but couldn't refuse. Together, they dug and cleared, but the soil was too sodden to rebuild at once. So Reed bundled herbs to dry the air. Hazel prepared a bed of moss, and Pip offered half his own cupboard space for Thistle's belongings. For several days, Thistle lived at Hazel's oak. At first he bristled at the closeness, muttering about squeaky mice and Pip's chatter. But gradually, something shifted. He joined Hazel in the kitchen, showing her how to roast roots until crisp. He played a slow, haunting tune on Pip's whistle when he thought no one was listening. He even helped Bramble copy notes by holding parchment steady with his spines. One evening, as the rain eased and stars peeked out, Hazel brought him a cup of mint tea. "It's nice having you here," she said. Thistle sipped in silence, then grunted softly. "It's not terrible." The others smiled, for they knew what that really meant. When the burrow was finally safe again, Thistle returned to it with relief. Yet he came back more often afterward, less distant, a little more at ease. The storm had taken his home for a time, but it had given him something just as precious, a deeper bond with his friend. The end. Thank you for joining us in the quiet corners of Chestnut Hollow. If you enjoyed this story and would like to wander with us again, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who love cozy woodland adventures. Until next time, may your days be gentle and your evenings restful.